Hello, everyone. Welcome to Conexão Metabooks, second episode of this second season. I'll talk in Portuguese for a little bit, guys, and then we go back to English. Bem-vindo a todos, pessoal que está nos assistindo no Facebook da Metabooks e no Facebook do Publish News. É legal a gente ter vocês aqui nessa segunda temporada da Conexão Metabooks. Hoje é o segundo episódio, Espere o inesperado, os números da pandemia na indústria do livro. Como alguns já estão acostumados, a conversa vai ser em inglês, e daqui a alguns dias nós vamos disponibilizar essa conversa legendada em português também, nos diversos canais de mídia da MVB, da Metabooks. Então eu vou voltar para o inglês agora, e espero que vocês aproveitem. So, we have here today Ruediger Wischenbart from Austria. He's the founder of Content and Consulting since 2003. He is a writer specialized in cultural industry, and we know him as a book markets analyst. He has a few statistics to share with us, and then we are going to discuss a few ideas and ask some tricky questions to him. By the way, everyone, you feel free to write us questions on the Facebook chat. You are welcome to ask Ruediger or Ed or both of us. And we have Edward Nawotka. He's a journalist. He's the book-selling and international editor of Publishers Weekly and editorial advisor and co-creator of Publishers Weekly Español. Bienvenido, señor Ed.
Hola.
So we are going to talk about the statistics and how the numbers are showing the market after more than a year of pandemic, lockdowns, and etc. But before that, could you please give us a quick view on the market before the pandemic? How was it on your sides? What did you see before the pandemic? Was the market growing, stable, going down? What's going on before that?
Ruediger?
Thank you for the nice intro, Ricardo. As I'm talking about Europe, I must say we had already a very diverse situation across the different European countries before the pandemic. We had a big difference between the English language, the British market on the one hand, and all the others on the continent in other languages. We had in some countries like Spain or Italy, after the economic crisis of 2008, a big slump in Spain. Up to 1/3 of the market was lost, and then a recovery over the past 3-4 years. We had very different penetrations with digital in different countries. Scandinavia going digital in a very specific way, much more strongly than, for instance, Germany or France. On the other hand, Germany and France were both in the print segment, very robust and, if you allow me the word, very boring markets, because it was going up a little bit or going down a little bit, but nothing really of a transformation. And what we've seen in the pandemic year of 2020, that all these rather small developments suddenly got seriously accelerated.
Great. Ed?
I agree, and I like this description of a boring market, which is very much how you would describe the US. I mean, we have this paradoxical term called flat growth, in which you'll see a rise of maybe 1 to 2 to 3%. 3% would be very generous. That would be considered a fantastic year. And it's been like that for a decade or two. The real action in the US has been on the book selling side, where we've had a lot of questions surrounding the market dominance of Amazon. This is all prior to the pandemic. At the end of 2019, the news came out that approximately 1/3 of all US independent bookstores looked to be at risk of closing. And that was prior to the pandemic. So we can talk about what that impact might have been on what the pandemic might have been, and the factors that actually proved positive for them. Canada is much the same. It's sort of a flat growth market in the sense that it's steady and stable and somewhat reliable. A lot of the digital transformation issues that played out over the last decade didn't have a significant impact, aside from audiobooks, which continue to show extraordinary growth. And in the pandemic, there was an interesting little twist where they continued to grow, but people were staying at home. So they weren't growing quite as much last year. And around the world, though, we're seeing some other changes. I mean, Africa and Asia is very much a digital story. I mean, that's very much a story, not about physical books, but about the acceleration. And in fact, I would say it's what we're going to look forward to in the future. I mean, you're seeing new reading patterns, new patterns of creation, all of it digitally based, and all of it's very much based on social interactive reading and writing platforms. And I think that there are also stories to be told about that in North America as well, which I will get to in my talk. And so yeah, that's where we were at just prior to the pandemic.
Nice. Thank you for this overview. And so maybe now you both can share with us your statistics from this period. Ruediger, would you like to start sharing with us?
Yes, happy to do so. Let me share my screen for a moment. Here we go. Can you just nod if you hear me properly? I suppose so. Yes, I see that that works fine. So I want to walk you through basically 3 chapters. One is about the highly diverse trends across Europe. 2 is the roller coaster of lockdown versus the long time trends. And the third chapter is about digital. We see, for instance, the United Kingdom, which, despite all of the lockdown and despite all of the crisis, had significant growth, both in value and in volume in 2020. And major publishing companies like Bloomsbury had fantastic financial results. That could not be the case in a market like Germany, or as we will see in a minute in France, where bookshops were closed for a significant period of time, 2 times in March and again in November, December. And we saw several very interesting trends. Number one, it was declining, but by volume. So in copies sold, the decline was much more significant because publishers tried to compensate by raising the retail prices of books. Let me remind you that the book price is regulated and fixed, so you cannot do any promotion campaigns over the price. So they tried to save a little bit their bottom line by going up with the prices, but that opened a very, very, very significant gap between stationary retailers, so brick and mortar bookstores, which went down in 2020 by almost 9% in money and 12% in copies sold. And the rest was compensated by online bookstores. So the 2 big players in online bookselling, on the one hand, of course, Amazon, but also a domestic chain comparable to Barnes & Noble in the US, they had fairly good years because they had been prepared to jump into the breach when the brick and mortar had to close. A similar picture emerged in France with, again, a drop in sales. And we see that, even the title production went down very significantly because quite a lot of new releases were postponed by half a year or a year. And at the same time, which was very surprising, France being a very conservative, print-oriented reading country, suddenly ebooks and also digital audio saw quite a substantial rise. And similar to Germany, it was online book selling that had a good year. The small bookstores could, by home delivery and things like this, make up for some of their losses. But the bigger brick and mortar chain bookstores, they had a really nasty year. Very interesting is Italy, which had been in deep trouble 10 years ago, 8 years ago, and after a big bottom, was gaining traction again over the last 3-4 years. And suddenly, even in the crisis year, remember, the north of Italy was very, very strongly hit by the pandemic. This big crisis in Milan, in the big commercial cities in the north. And they could, at the end of the day, have growth. And of course, online was the big winner. And the most extreme picture can be seen in Sweden, where for the first time ever, the number of digital unit sales, and that means ebooks and digital audiobooks, was bigger than all the physical sales combined. Just think of that. That is very unique. And to make it even more exceptional, most of these digital sales were subscription sales. So a new distribution and business model in publishing was outperforming all the rest. Second chapter, what is this in a long-term perspective in the case of Germany, Austria, and Switzerland over a time span of 10 years, 2011 to 2019 and 20. We see first, how was the year of 2020? You see the lockdown, the green columns show 2020, the dark gray columns show 2019. You see in the first and the second lockdown period a deep slump. But that was building on a year of 2019 and years before, where for one decade you had a continuous small slide year over year over year, with only one exception, 2016. And it gets really interesting when you look into the detail of having these 10 years drawn into one chart. You have one month by month from January to December, all these 10 years from 2011 to 2020. And normally everybody would think 2020, the lockdown year, the COVID pandemic year, must be totally exceptional. It is much less exceptional in fact than we thought, because it just accelerated slides like the decline in the share of the Christmas sales in December at the far right of the picture, or the travel season, in the holiday season in summer declined continuously, with very few exceptions over the past decade. So this is really to show how much COVID was an accelerator of existing trends. Next finding, which is very important in my understanding, is that the book market is not a homogeneous market anymore. By category, for instance, by genre category, we see big differences between fiction and children and young adult. Both in terms of how the year evolves between the seasons, but also we see that the children and young adult segment was hit much less during the COVID closures than fiction. People bought a lot of books for their kids, and people didn't bother so much to spend money on buying titles of fiction. But again, this is not at all exceptional for the pandemic year of 2020. This follows a long time trend over the past decade, which you can see here for both genre categories, fiction and young adult and children, in the red dotted line. Third chapter, very quickly, digital. Expectedly, this is about ebooks in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland in the German language market. Digital grew. And even during the lockdown, which is the dotted line around, in the first lockdown of March, we see overall a continuous growth. But when we look at audiobooks, which are really the big driver of growth and of a dynamic segment of the market, we made a very interesting observation. The red line shows you what happens to to audiobook downloads. So when you buy one audiobook at a time and download it for your kids or for yourself to listen to, there was the expected peak at the beginning of the lockdown. Everybody was busy, particularly to buy children's and young adult audiobooks to entertain the children. Also, educational materials had a good time. But then it was going back down very quickly because everybody had their stocks, and then the sales flattened out. After the pandemic, after the lockdown was over, you had another peak. Overall, the level after the lockdown was higher than before, but it was a short-lived peak. Exactly the contrary happened to subscription models. They grew throughout the year continuously, and that is so interesting because for years, most people in the book trade all over Europe would tell us, oh, subscription doesn't work for books and reading. Here we see suddenly with subscription in digital, there is another trend. And when we see the full year, we see even twice that big peak in the download revenue, but the continuous growth, and that's continuing in 2021, I'm sure, the continuous growth in subscription. That was a few trends that I wanted to talk about, and I'm very interested to see what Ed will tell us about other parts of the world. Now I need to find my button to end the screen sharing. Here we go. So I guess
What happened? Ooh. Hello?
Hello, hello.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Perfect.
I need to find the right camera, but I can do this.
That's okay. Ed, please go ahead and share with us.
Absolutely. Happy to do it. Okay, so I'm going to try. Now we're going to go through my sharing of the screen, and we're going to take this one. Okay. Hi, everybody. I hope you can see me, and I assume you can. So I am going to talk about the US book market overall. It's very interesting what Ruediger was saying about subscription. We don't quite have the same trends. And again, North America, covering the US and Canada, tends to be somewhat distinct. The size of the market is roughly the same size as the entirety of Europe. So we often view ourselves as exceptional and a market leader and a harbinger of things to come, but that's not always the case, as we will be demonstrating going ahead. So just to start, overall book sales for 2020 were up 8% for the year, quite a good number, not dissimilar from what happened in the UK. Our unit sales were up an exceptional 26% overall. It was quite a good year for that. But that's going to be impacted by some other issues that I'll talk about later, particularly supply chain issues. The adult trade books was our strongest segment in the US. Those were up 12%. And children's and young adult books were up 6.5%. Very much for the same reasons that Ruediger was talking about in Europe. We had several months of lockdowns. They varied from area or from state to state, so from region to region within the United States. But by and large, the largest consumers of books tend to be on the coasts, which also had the strongest lockdowns. Much like in Europe, bookstores were trying to innovate. A lot of them were doing online shipping. A lot of them were offering curbside pickup. One of the big factors that I won't go into too much detail about was in the middle of last summer, following the murder of George Floyd, the subsequent Black Lives protests, there was a big surge in book sales among Black booksellers, which was quite an interesting phenomena from the book business's point of view, because you suddenly had books that had been in the market for quite a while, but had not sold that many copies, and were now selling hundreds of thousands of copies. And some of these bookstores were back ordered 500, 2,000 copies for books. It was a huge surge of interest that gave books a big boost right in the middle of last summer. So moving on a little bit with sales again, many public schools teaching remotely for long stretches of last year. The kindergarten through high school instructional materials were down 20% compared to the previous year. No surprise. Higher ed, meaning university level, again, also down somewhat as they turn to a hybrid digital model. Okay, so looking at formats, in the adult book segment, sales of both print and digital were up for the year, and hardcover sales were the strongest increase, up about 18.9% over 2019, which is quite an interesting number. I mean, hardcovers, these are the most expensive volumes, but you will see that the biggest hardcover of all last year was Barack Obama's first volume of his autobiography, or of his memoir rather, presidential memoir, A Promised Land. That was an expensive book too, $45 cover price. And that really pushed sales up 25% for the month in December. So we did see a really strong end of the year, which really helped book sales. And that book was a big factor. What happens when you have a big bestseller like that, it brings people to bookstores, or it brings them online to go book shopping. And what you need that kind of driver. Very much the American business has been driven by titles like that. There were a number of political books, anti-Trump books that were very big in 2019 that also drove similar type of numbers. Interestingly, trade paperback were up as well, by almost 8%. Mass market, which are the smaller format airport type novels, those were down, but those have been in decline for many years now. A lot of those sales tend to shift towards ebooks. Overall, adult sales inched up about 10.3%. Again, 8.5 to 10.3. You're going to see some fungibility, some fungibility in the statistics, which, as we know with the coronavirus, a lot of things are not quite as reliable. Also with the US, because Amazon has such a dominant market share for book sales, at least half is what we're expecting. Some of the numbers can be a little bit hard to track because Amazon tends to not share good data with their suppliers or with the media or people like ourselves. So that can skew the statistics a touch. Ebooks did really well. They had been plateaued, even somewhat declining for several years. That was a trend that we saw reversed. Instead of accelerated, actually reversed. And they were up 11% over 2019. But a big factor of that was print sales had such a bigger annual increase. Ebooks' overall share of sales actually fell just a tiny bit. One of the most interesting things that we've seen talked about from publishers is that we saw a flip in the type of books that were being bought. A lot of readers were gravitating to authors that they already knew, which that means that the new books, what we call front list and backlist sales, actually flipped. Where previously publishers would be selling about 65% front list, new books, 35% backlist for the year, that number actually flipped over. It's 65% backlist and 35% front list. It's probably the most interesting thing to happen last year. It gave a real big boost to authors who already had established audiences and platforms. And it meant that what happened is a lot of new debut books had a really hard time hitting the market. One of the factors, and I mention this again later, is that some 500 front list books were also delayed. They were canceled for last year and they were moved into this year, into 2021, or even next year, 2022. And we anticipate that that's going to really accelerate this glut of discoverability issues, the challenge of finding new books. And if sales have reversed last year to favor backlist, it's going to be even more challenging to get new books into the market. Speeding up a little bit and focusing on children's and YA for a minute, digital sales really skyrocketed for YA and children's. They were up, ebooks were up 70%. But they still are a relatively small part of the overall revenue, about 5 to 5.5% for overall children's books. Children's is very much a print platform. Again, no surprise here, downloadable audio sales were up 37% with kids, and they still account for less than 5% of revenue, though. A lot of parents were experimenting with ways to entertain their kids. They couldn't get out to bookstores. They could not get out to libraries. They turned to the computer and started downloading new materials, probably for the first time ever. Board books also had a great year. Sales were up nearly 20% and accounted for 8% of overall sales. These are the heavier books for younger children. Okay. And just to go over some big themes with the US, again, until the coronavirus is under control, reliable forecasts just are not possible. When we want to prognosticate, we really have to take everything with a grain of salt. The coronavirus, like with that flip between front list and backlist sales, the coronavirus really showed us things can be quite a bit unpredictable. As I mentioned, at the end of 2019, a third of US bookstores were looking at closing, potentially, or we at least had put themselves on the verge of closing. That could have been anywhere between 800 and 1,000 stores. That is virtually gone. At most, we're going to have a usual turnover, which is about somewhere between 1% and 5% a year. But some of those stores that close are then replaced by new stores or growing bookstore chains. I mentioned the challenge is that discovery became a really big challenge. And what I mean by discovery is simply the ability to market and or present a book to the public. The media was very much obsessed with the coronavirus. Bookstores, which remain the primary means of book discovery, even frankly, for Amazon, because a lot of people still window shop in bookstores and then go and order it online. With those avenues closed, it meant that discovery was a huge challenge. That is going to be one of maybe the biggest questions, is publishers are going to need to reimagine marketing and look at it as a digital first endeavor. They're going to really need to stop focusing on marketing the print, but see digital as the main means. I mentioned this again. A few trends we saw: health and wellness, really big. Cookbooks, that may have peaked already. The home fitness ones may have peaked. What I anticipate and what a lot of people are seeing is mental health. As the fallout for the coronavirus takes hold with people, even as things appear to return to normal. Health and wellness, particularly mental health, these are going to be a big issue. And racial politics, at least in the United States, continues to be a huge subject. Diversity, equity, inclusion subjects, LGBTQ issues, anything to touch on the fight and the challenge of attaining racial and social justice in the United States. Any of those books that address those topics are going to be and will continue to be popular. Maybe not in the same extraordinary numbers, not 500,000 copies that we saw last summer, but still will remain popular. If 2020 taught us anything, it's that publishers really need to think digital first, print second, particularly when it comes to marketing and sales. Even though we had this huge surge in print sales, one of the issues was we have a real limited printing capacity in the United States. There were a lot of consolidations in printers, a lot of print shops closed. There became a crunch, particularly when a book like Barack Obama's comes on the market. It pushes reprints out of the market for other publishers. And that's a real problem going forward. A lot of publishers are looking all over the world for anywhere they can find printing capacity. They're really looking for options. Another factor with bookstores was the rise of bookshop.org, which launched fortuitously in January last year as an alternative shopping stream for Amazon, for people who did not want to shop on Amazon and wanted to buy a book from their own independent bookshop. And perhaps that independent bookstore did not have a robust website. Bookshop acts like an Amazon for indies, is maybe the easiest way to describe it. Many of you are already familiar with it. It launched in the UK very successfully last fall. It just launched in Spain, I believe 2 or 3 days ago. And it aggregates all these websites from all of these independent bookstores and gives you a chance to buy a book, have it delivered to your house, and then the credit, at least part of the credit, goes back to your local indie. This helped a lot of bookstores when they were locked down. This put a lot of money in booksellers' pockets that they would have lost more than likely to Amazon. I cannot underscore how important this was last year. Whether people will continue to patronize bookshop.org remains to be seen, but it looks like they have a pretty firm hold in the market now. A few other trends that I want to talk about in the US, which also sort of, when you start looking at the rest of the world, and Ruediger touched on this, are very important, is investors. We saw a lot of money last year as far as innovation in publishing go towards social reading and social writing apps and platforms. Kindle Vella, which is Amazon's platform for social writing and reading, just launched just a short time ago. You always had KDP, Kindle Direct Publishing, but this is more of a model that's more akin to what you'd find in a Wattpad or a China Literature. One of the biggest deals last year was when in Korea, a Korean company purchased Wattpad, several $100 million. You saw money going into that. One of the areas in the US you saw money being invested to was there were several digital book club platforms that received upwards. One in Austin, Texas, called Literati, which also does book clubs, and they do subscription boxes, received upwards of a $40 million investment. It's quite a significant one. Another one called bookclub.org is launching. And then there's Fable, which received about an $8.5 million investment. These are kind of an interesting phenomena. We can talk about why. A lot of it has to do with people being locked at home and wanting sociability, and book clubs providing a means to do that. Digital book clubs provide sociability. This is happening, and this is true in Asia as well as at the US. Not the book clubs specifically, but the social reading and writing platforms. We all know about China Literature, which is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, in the entire world. Sorry about these spelling errors here. But one of the outgrowths of their success in China is we're actually starting to see Chinese publishing power make itself fully known in the US. There was a company last year called Astra Publishing, which is funded. It's a subsidiary of a company called Thinkingdom, which is a Chinese company. And they launched a very high-end publishing house in the US. Their first books are starting to come out. They poached several really, really good editors, publishing professionals from The big five, they're really making a play at making themselves into a serious publishing house, serious publishing endeavor. Not only that, the head of Tencent's China Literature, they have a US-based English language site called Web Novel, similar again to Wattpad, if you will. And they told the South China Morning Post just a couple of weeks ago that they now have nearly 50 million readers outside of China for China Literature, meaning Web Novel, the English language platform primarily. And they are planning on attracting 100,000 authors and writers to their platform in North America this year. You cannot ignore that. When we want to look at another digital story, something that Ruediger alluded to, when you look at Africa, the big story of the past year was the lack of digital infrastructure in the publishing industry in Africa. We're talking 52 to 54 countries, depending on how you count them. When everybody got locked down in Africa and you didn't have the digital infrastructure, finding a means to do remote education was really a challenge. And that was actually one of the things that the IPA, through their funding projects for African publishers, are trying to address. If you look at the award winners that were given grants through Dubai Cares and the IPA this past year, all of them, for the most part, are focused on digital learning and creating digital learning assets for various African countries. And I think that if you want to follow an interesting story that's going to develop in a really interesting trajectory, I think you look to Africa for digital innovation. It's not something that you would necessarily expect, but because they don't have entrenched forms of digital publishing, they can then leapfrog. They can essentially use and employ the latest technology, the latest platforms, the latest best practices without the impediment of legacy systems that will slow them down, or the people feel that they already have a sunk cost invested in that they're not willing to risk. Likewise, that will also be true of the professionals who will be implementing it. In the US, in Europe, we have a lot of professionals who've spent their entire career working one particular way, who have see no upside to hastening a transition to digital, even though the coronavirus accelerated and may have forced us into some of that. So I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to having a conversation with everyone. Okay. So, yeah. All good. Okay. Hello.
Hi, we are back.
Fantastic.
Yeah, man, it's a lot of information to digest. Both of you had lots of things to share with us. Thank you very much for so many information. I'll try to focus on a few points, maybe a little bit closer to us. But I really encourage our audience to come back to this this record on our to this live that's going to be record on our Facebook, because I think there are lots of things that we can learn with US, Canada, Europe, Africa. Information you brought about Africa, Ed, was very interesting for me. But both of you talked about the growth of digital sales. It was huge in Europe. It was big thing in the US as well. But every time I hear about growth in digital sales, I think about the reflex of this on the revenues of the company? Because usually digital books are cheaper than print books, of course. So what can you tell us? Can you compare this? Is digital sales already enough to cover this difference, to make it even, or even making more money than the print, or how is that on the revenue side?
I would have 2 or 3 points on that. Number one, for me, the most striking single aspect of 2020 was that all the big corporations had terrific years in terms of profitability. They all made more money. So obviously they sold more digital than physical compared to previous years. And that coincided with a clear rise in profitability. So they found a few tricks in making their homework, arranging their company processes, and then being more profitable. Yeah, that's the first thing. That's a very strong indicator. But it also, second thing, shows this is process optimization, which is much easier to get accomplished for a big corporation who can invest into these. This is not about ebooks or audiobooks. This is about company processes, which requires investment beforehand. Mm-hmm. So that is something where corporations are in a much stronger position. So it will really increase the gap between the big guys and the middle-sized guys. Yeah, and I think the big threat is not loss from digital, but pressure on the middle part of the market. Number three, we in a way asked the right question in a not so good way by again and still juxtaposing the print and the digital. There is not one digital part in the industry. What we are handling now is a mixed universe of many formats, print, physical, and various digital formats, different channels of distribution, lots of direct to consumer, lots of, here I'm very much and strongly echoing Ed, digital marketing, which comes in. Yeah, and so publishers and even more distributors must learn to handle a much more complex universe of different formats, different channels, direct-to-consumer marketing, understanding the consumer, retrieving the feedback from the consumer reaction. That requires a lot of learning. And here again, the big corporations can set up a team for just that. Small, medium-sized companies have a much harder stand in creating, finding the resources and setting up teams to be up to operating successfully in such complicated times.
Yeah. I mean, it's the same. I mean, if you look, the statistics answer your question really, at least in the US side, overall volume of sales was up 26%, but the revenue was only up 8%. So you had this huge spike in the volume of sales, but the actual money didn't reflect that. And as Ruediger mentioned, direct to consumer sales, digital books are not necessarily cheaper price wise in the US anymore. And they're not significantly cheaper, but publishers also have added expenses of digital marketing, which isn't always as cheap as you might think it is. But they did a lot with direct to consumer sales last year, and particularly with ebooks, because your only other major sales channel for ebooks in the US is Amazon. Kobo is a player, but not nearly as significant a one in the US as it is in other countries. I mean, it's still dominant in Canada, but in fact, it's a bigger footprint elsewhere in the world than in the US. Its US partners, Walmart, but you can't find a Kobo e-reader in a Walmart, which is kind of unusual. So, and you do see, and again, as Ruediger mentioned, you are seeing a confluence of all these different formats. So the question is, how is the strategy going to apply across all these different formats? I'll mention very specifically, a lot of what drives independent bookstore sales will be events. Well, when the bookstores were all shut down, they all turned to virtual events. Well, we've now all know about Zoom fatigue, as they call it, right? And when we look back at the last year, when you talk to publishers, were virtual events successful? They weren't. They were not. They were ineffective at best at selling books. They were merely a placeholder. So really, the question is how are people going to find a way in the post-corona world to to push people either directly into bookstores or to interact more with authors, which kind of plays into why when I mentioned those book clubs, bookclub.com, which is launching, it has yet to launch, it's in beta. Their whole platform is predicated on the idea of authors hosting their own online bookstores or book clubs, selling books directly to their fan base, and and interacting with their readers directly. And that company received a significant investment, much like Literati, which is another one I mentioned, and as well as Fable. I mean, these are all platforms that are essentially trying to replicate a kind of interactive experience online with reader and writer specifically. So
I very much like that reference that you just did, Ed, because I guess at some point last summer, in halfway through the first year of COVID, I read a little sentence from Ben Evans, a Silicon Valley analyst, who said when he's now sitting in Zoom conferences, it reminds him of how e-commerce sites felt in 2005. Yeah, and that gives you an idea how early days it is when we are sitting here in these patchworks of funny images, and add here, for instance, as a second force or factor, the unbundling mentioned by Ed, when the whole thing is not driven by a moderator and experts anymore, but by authors creating and replicating and extending their community, and then engaging. And the flow of sales is something that comes through it, but it's not that you first need to go into a virtual bookstore or into a virtual book presentation event.
Exactly. We even saw there was an author named Cory Doctorow, who's a science fiction writer, very big proponent of DRM-free, digital publishing, and he had a sequel to one of his most popular books, which was called Little Brother. The sequel came out last year, and he knew that, for example, he did not want to publish the audiobook on audible.com, which is Amazon's audiobook platform, and very much has 90 to 95% of the market for audiobooks in the US. So he recorded it himself. He put it up on Kickstarter for pre-sale, and he did nearly $250,000 in sales. I believe it was somewhere well north of $200,000. Cory's a very popular author, but that's an extraordinary number of direct-to-consumer sales for an author. That's a lot of money for somebody. For something, a digital product, it doesn't have to ship, it's a direct download. I mean, the production may have cost him maybe $50,000, but then you're still talking about clearing close to $100,000 in profit potentially for an author.
How do you want to spend $50,000 on recording an audiobook? I think you can take off 1 0.
Or you could hire celebrities, which I think is what he did in Los Angeles. Yeah, you hire celebrity authors, readers rather.
Guys, we are talking. You mentioned, especially you mentioned book clubs, a lot. I don't know how is that in Europe right now. I follow more what's going on the U.S. recently on book clubs, but Bia Alves is asking here on our chat on Facebook. She says, bookclub.com looks quite interesting. I wonder if a wholesaler will be in charge of distribution to readers, or if it will look more like bookshop.org. Any of you have any knowledge on this?
Most often this situation is they use a drop shipper. So they'll use somebody like Ingram Books in the US to drop ship. And that's when Ingram is very good. It's a very turnkey solution. And so there's a very strong likelihood, or there's a strong likelihood that they'll have their publisher fulfill it directly from their warehouse and drop ship that way. So if you're a Penguin Random House author, PRH, Hachette, they all have very, very robust direct-to-consumer distribution options. So, or not necessarily direct to consumer, but sometimes they talk about partnering with bookstores as well, which I know is a more popular platform in Germany and Europe, is where you order online, it gets delivered to your local bookstore, and then you go and pick it up, or the bookstore does the last kilometer delivery, as they say.
Yeah. Ruediger, do you have any knowledge about book clubs in Europe? How is that going? Is that something strong?
I haven't heard a lot about bookshops. I have heard a lot about community-driven initiatives from bookshops, but that's different, yeah. And we started last fall a conference series called Reboot, which, by the way, is continuing right now, and where we try to have very diverse audiences and speakers from around the world discussing how the impact of the pandemic on the bookstores and on the publishing and on the fulfillment has been evolving. And there was one very, very interesting experience. We saw the CEO of the largest German chain bookstore, Thalia, engaging in conversation with a small Mexican publisher and distributor. And then there was a guy from Greece joining the conversation, and all said, we had a wonderful time in the lockdown because we, at the various levels and scopes and scales, went into building and working very intensely with our communities of customers. And this was click and collect, a very simple trick when the bookshop is closed, but you can order online and then pick it up at the doorstep of the bookshop, was very, very gaining much traction and popularity across the board in Europe. So you saw not formal book clubs popping up, but reinforced community relationships between stores, chain bookstores, and small bookstores with their end consumers. And that was a very, very strong impact, I guess, also in the mindset of many people.
Thank you, Ruediger. Wonder Endo is asking about crowdfunding. What is the role of crowdfunding for publishing industry, and did it change because of pandemic? Do you guys have numbers about it in US or Europe?
I can address the US part. I mean, it's been a very popular means of getting projects off the ground. You know, I mentioned Cory Doctorow used it as a platform to pre-sell his audiobook, which had been produced. Also, he used obviously some of those funds to do the production. You're seeing some of the people have more unorthodox ideas. Maybe they're doing a graphic novel. Maybe they're doing a niche type of publication. So it's a very popular platform for creators. It had the biggest impact last year on bookstores. I would venture to say somewhere between 25, 30, maybe upwards of 35% of bookstores, independent bookstores in the US, turned to crowdfunding at some point during last year to make ends meet. Especially early on in the pandemic, we just saw a whole rash of bookstores go to GoFundMe, Kickstarter, try to raise anywhere from 50 to some bookstores raised upwards of $300,000. Marcus Books, which is arguably the oldest Black-owned bookstore in the United States, which is in San Francisco, Oakland, California, raised over $300,000, in part because of the Black Lives Matter movement, which reignited people's interest in the store. But they had put up that Kickstarter in January, well before anything that had happened with the huge surge in sales of Black books. So people are seeing it as a means to an end. Not everybody wants to go that direction. Sometimes in fact, I have an article coming out on Sunday in my local paper in Houston about a new Black bookstore, and they're self-funding it directly because what they want to do is they want to make sure people come in and buy books and not just see them as a charity to give them money. They said, when we want people to see us as a charity, we'll ask them for money so we can give books away and not sell books, which I thought was an interesting point of view. So yeah.
Interesting.
Quite different in Europe, where crowdfunding and books have not really found together so far. There is one very good exception in the United Kingdom, a London-based publisher of nonfiction, created by successful nonfiction authors a while ago, 10 years or 8 years ago, unbound.com. They experimented from the start with crowdfunding and use crowdfunding systematically, not only to raise money, but to connect and build a community of consumers. They are the big exception from what I know. In continental Europe, I wouldn't see any of that to have materialized so far.
Can I throw something in there,
Sure,
Ricardo? I mean, the one thing I found myself saying a lot in these type of sessions is because, especially for the last maybe 2-3 years, when we've all been talking about Audible, and for example, audiobooks really was the biggest growth driver. And if you're looking at the Spanish-speaking world and Latin America, and Brazil, Latin America, Mexico, I mean, audiobooks have really exploded. Storytel, of course, is one of the biggest, if not the biggest success story. They reached 1.5 million users this year in January. They went from 250,000 users who were not in the Nordics, so outside the Nordics, to 500,000 this year. You're seeing huge investments in audiobooks, particularly in the Spanish-speaking world, because you referenced that I work and help launch Publishers Weekly in Espanol. So we're tracking this, and I'm going to go back. Let me go back to 1999, when Audible was a tiny little company run out of New Jersey that was on the verge of closing. I've had an Audible account, I looked now, for well on 22, 23 years. And you know what? Audible was considered a big failure for quite a long time. And the digital audiobook format was considered something that was not to be respected. It was just sort of this curiosity. Amazon bought it, and it took Amazon a good 5 to 6, maybe close to a decade to make it a success. Okay, so my only point in this is when we look at formats, when we look at digital publishing, when we look at innovation, something that might, like crowdfunding, like Unbound, which, as Ruediger mentioned, this is why I bring it up. It's been around for 10 years. It's slowly been kind of catching on as a trend. I think it's important not to dismiss these trends that we saw, or that these ideas that we saw a decade ago that didn't work. There's Sesame is a company that just launched in Sweden, and in particularly because they said, well, we want to oppose the idea of zombie subscriptions. So as Ruediger mentioned, in Sweden, more than half of the books were sold digitally, and in a large part driven by subscriptions. And Sesame is basically going to offer an a la carte model for buying audio and digital books. This is not a new model, not by any stretch of the imagination. But they seem to think they can make it work. So I think if you want to look at what could be a good direction, what we could see in the next couple of years is perhaps a revitalization of some of these platforms and formats that we dismissed. Creation tools have become very inexpensive. And as competition heats up on platforms like YouTube and TikTok, for example, to market books, TikTok's become a hugely successful digital marketing platform for publishers, particularly for YA. Why won't we revisit things like interactive books or interactive digital media that publishers are going to want to have content? As creators are more prolific than ever before. So I think publishers, I'm not saying that we're going to necessarily see a revitalization of these things, but I think ignoring and overlooking these things that we dismissed in the past as failures, I think we might see some of these things come back, and I think it's going to be really. I think it's going to be kind of really interesting. We might have another surge of that kind of digital hysteria that we had about 10 years ago. A little bit low, even now a little longer ago than that. So, just guessing.
Yeah. Look, friends, we are getting to the end of our time. It really passed fast, although time doesn't go faster than it is. But I had like another 4 or 5 questions here, but I'll end with one question for you both. I think that's pretty nice to close our conversation. Ed, you mentioned on your topics that it's not possible to do any, I call, futuristic exercise right now about what's going to happen after the pandemic. But probably Ruediger and Ed, you could highlight what could publishers and booksellers learn from this past year. What are the lessons for publishers and booksellers they can take from this time under the pandemic? Could you wrap up our conversation with that?
I mean, I keep it really simple. I think that people, at the beginning of last year, when this started, we all thought it was going to be the end of the world, basically. Not literally, but for our bookstores closed, books were canceled, authors couldn't go on tour. Everybody, literally half of the people who were of working age in the United States applied at some point last year for unemployment, meaning that they were out of work. That's 1 out of every 2. It's an extraordinary number, and it's terrifying. And it was a very difficult year for everybody emotionally, financially, psychologically. But what did people turn to when they needed entertainment and succor? When they got sick of streaming Netflix, and when they looked at their kids and they said, "Get off that tablet," books. Books really proved to be a resilient form of entertainment and education for people when they needed it most, and when they had every other option in the world that they could download on the internet. They turned to books, and books did pretty well. So I think just being reassured that the business is durable and resilient is what that people can take away from that. And I think that that's something that we can take a lot of faith in. Put a lot of faith in. Yeah.
I guess I would a little bit reframe that observation by saying perhaps the most important thing is what booksellers, publishers, authors can learn is that they are embedded in a social fabric of relationships. Yeah, that can be partly digital. Long-term, only digital is a stretch, but insisting in all levels, in all steps of their business processes to invest in that social fabric and into that creating and sustaining of communities is probably the strongest lesson that they can tear out. I mentioned in this Reboot conference series this small Mexican publisher who, it was in October, so we were in the middle of really the turmoil, said, well, it's been good times for those who survive. Yeah, and it's these 2 parts of the inside. Not everybody is in a position to take advantage of this and do this, actually. We are confronting winners and losers, and that's brutal. And when I'm speaking about the social fabric, this is also a way to be aware that you need to soften that rift between the ones and the others. And books and booksellers and publishers and authors and readers and all these connections can play a very important role in bridging these gaps and in patching these rifts, and make the business more sustainable, more robust, even when it's really tough times.
Great. Thank you, Ruediger. Thank you, Ed. To our audience, guys, if you want to know about the market, follow Edward Nawotka on Facebook, Twitter. Follow Ruediger on Facebook. Next week, there is a conference on rebootbooks.org. You can go to the website and see there how you do to be part of it, to attend to that. And I can tell you it's very interesting because you're going to have professionals from many parts of the world, different countries where we don't usually have much connection. It's really nice to be connected to these guys. Thank you very
Ricardo.
much.
I can only emphasize this. Rebootbooks.org.
And a small word em português. Dia 29 de abril, teremos o próximo episódio do Conexão Metabooks, do autor ao leitor, as livrarias como ponto de conexão. O mediador nessa oportunidade vai ser o Leonardo Neto, do Publish News. Nós teremos a Mônica Carvalho, o Gustavo Faraon e a Beth, da Livraria Vanguarda do Sul, participando dessa conversa. So, thank you, everyone. Have all you a very good day. Ruediger, have a good evening. It's more than 7 at your place. Enjoy your time. Thank you very much. Oh, okay. I need to wait another time, a few hours. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Have a great afternoon.